Ryan wiped the grease from his hands with a worn red shopcloth and stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching Sandra fold the last of her sweaters into a cardboard box. She moved quietly, deliberately, the way people move when they've already made peace with a decision long before they announce it. The apartment was small. It had always been small, but tonight it felt like it was shrinking around him with every item she lifted off the shelf. A candle she'd bought. A book she'd never finished. Small pieces of a life that was quietly coming apart at the seams. 3 years. That's what sat between them in that room, unspoken and heavy. Ryan had met Sandra on a Tuesday night in October, raining so hard the gutters were overflowing on 5th Street. Her car had died 2 blocks from her apartment, alternator blown, battery completely dead, stranded alone at 11 p.m. She'd called the shop number on a faded sticker someone had slapped on a nearby telephone pole, half expecting no one to pick up. Ryan picked up on the second ring. He showed up 20 minutes later in his old pickup, tools in the bed, a thermos of coffee in his hand, and stayed until 2 a.m. in the pouring rain until her car started clean. He never charged her. She'd called him her hero that night, laughing under the yellow glow of his work light, rain dripping off both of them. He'd thought that was the beginning of something that would last. He hadn't been wrong. He'd just underestimated how quietly things could end. "You don't have to explain it again," Ryan said from the doorway, his voice low, careful not to wake Emma down the hall. Sandra paused with a picture frame in her hands, the 2 of them at the coast the summer before last, and set it gently in the box without looking at him. "I just think," she started, then stopped. Then started again. "He can give me things, Ryan. A real future. Stability. I'm not saying you're a bad person." "I know you're not," he said. "You're a great dad," she added, and somehow that landed harder than anything else she could have said. Because it was true, and because it was clearly not enough, and because she said it like a consolation prize being handed across a counter. Ryan had known this was coming for weeks. He'd felt it in the way she stopped asking about his day, in the way she started dressing differently on Thursday evenings, in the way she left her phone face down on the kitchen table. He wasn't a man who ignored signals. He was a mechanic. Reading what was wrong before it failed completely was the first skill he'd ever mastered. The man was named Gerald. Sandra had met him at her firm's corporate gala 3 months earlier. Gerald wore Italian suits and had the easy, unearned confidence of someone who had never once had to worry about a water bill. He had a company card and a penthouse view and a professional biography that used words like visionary and industry leader. Ryan had looked him up once, late at night after Emma fell asleep, and then closed the browser and never looked again. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Sandra's eyes had changed, and no amount of extra shifts or better shoes was going to change them back. "He can give me a life," she said finally, plainly, standing in the center of the room with the box against her hip. "You can barely cover daycare." Ryan didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago not to flinch at the truth, even when the truth was being used as a weapon. Because she wasn't entirely wrong. Things were tight. Emma was 5, full of energy, full of questions, full of a love so enormous it sometimes felt like it was the only thing holding the whole apartment together. Daycare cost nearly as much as the rent. The shop was profitable but not extravagant. It was his, built from nothing, but to the outside world it just looked like a garage on a side street with a hand-painted sign and a parking lot that needed repaving. He walked to the couch where Emma had fallen asleep with a crayon still loosely in her hand, a half-finished drawing of a horse resting on the cushion beside her. He sat on the armrest and looked at his daughter, the small steady rise and fall of her chest, the little furrow in her brow even in sleep, the way she always looked like she was quietly solving something, and felt the kind of calm that only she could give him. Sandra carried the box to the door. She paused there, and he could feel her waiting for something, an argument, maybe, or a plea, or at minimum a reaction she could carry out with her and examine later. But Ryan wasn't built for dramatic exits or last-minute speeches. He stood, crossed the room, and kissed her cheek once, gently, the way you say goodbye to something you genuinely loved. Then he held the door open. She walked through it. He stood at the window and watched her taillights disappear down the wet street towards something shinier, something that looked from the outside like everything she decided she deserved. He didn't blame her. He understood wanting more than what a small apartment and a side street garage could offer. He understood the pull of possibility. He just knew something she didn't. Ryan moved back to the couch, lifted Emma carefully so she didn't wake, carried her to her room, and tucked the dinosaur blanket up to her chin. She stirred once, murmured "Daddy," and went still again. He stood there in the dark for a long moment, one hand resting lightly on her back, listening to the quiet of the apartment settle around them like something familiar and good. Then he walked to the kitchen table, opened his laptop, poured himself a coffee, and began reviewing the quarterly performance reports for Callaway Automotive Group. All 47 locations. The numbers were strong. The new Houston flagship had exceeded projections by 18%. The training program he'd quietly funded at the Phoenix branch had cut turnover in half, and the technology division he'd been building in the background for 2 years was nearly ready to roll out nationwide. He made a few notes in the margin of the report, flagged 3 items for his operations director, and sent a brief message to his attorney confirming the details of next month's press event. He closed the laptop just before midnight, washed his coffee mug, and went to check on Emma one more time. Ryan Callaway had built his first garage at 19 with $11,000, a borrowed lift, and a mechanical instinct so precise that word spread faster than any advertisement ever could. By 24, he had 3 locations. By 28, he had 11. The expansion had been methodical, quiet, and entirely self-funded. No investors, no debt, no noise. He'd made a decision early on, after one too many people had changed the way they spoke to him once they learned what he was worth, that he would keep his life as close to ordinary as he possibly could. He drove a 10-year-old pickup. He wore the same work shirts he'd always worn. He did the school run in the morning and picked Emma up in the afternoon and fixed cars on the days he needed to feel like himself again. He wasn't hiding. He was protecting something. He'd learned, watching his own father lose friends the moment success arrived, that money had a way of distorting everything around it. The way people looked at you. The things they assumed. The way every relationship suddenly carried the faint background noise of calculation. Ryan didn't want that for Emma. He wanted her to grow up knowing that people showed up for each other before they knew what each other was worth. He wanted to be known honestly. And if that meant Sandra looked at his life and saw a mechanic in a small apartment who was barely covering daycare, well, he couldn't explain himself without dismantling the whole careful, intentional life he'd constructed around the things that actually mattered. So he hadn't. He turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the quiet apartment, the city a soft hum beyond the windows, Emma breathing steadily down the hall. There was no grief in his chest, not exactly. There was something more like space. Something that had been pressing against him for months had simply lifted, and what was left in its place was clear and open and oddly peaceful. He thought about Sandra driving toward Gerald's penthouse and the polished version of the future she was certain she'd found. He thought about the press event in 6 months, the one his PR director had been building toward for 2 years, the one that would formally introduce Callaway Automotive Group to the national market, complete with cameras and champagne and the kind of industry coverage that tended to change the shape of a room. He thought about how strange life was, and how patient it tended to be with people who simply kept building. Then Ryan Callaway, single father and 47-location automotive empire owner, went to bed. He had an early school run in the morning 6 months past the way good months do when a man is focused, quickly, quietly, and full of small moments worth keeping. Emma lost her first tooth on a Wednesday morning, right before school, and held it up to Ryan with the kind of triumph usually reserved for championship victories. He photographed it, framed the gap-toothed smile in his phone, and sent it to exactly 3 people: his sister, his operations director, and his attorney, who replied with a single thumbs up and a note that said very on brand for a man closing a $40 million quarter. Ryan laughed at that, buckled Emma into her booster seat, and drove her to kindergarten in the old pickup with the radio on low and her small hand tapping the door to whatever song was playing. These were the mornings he built everything else around. The press event had been 18 months in the making, a formal national introduction for Callaway Automotive Group, timed to coincide with the opening of the new flagship dealership on Meridian Avenue, the largest and most architecturally considered location in the entire portfolio. His design director had overseen every detail. Polished concrete floors. Floor-to-ceiling glass. A service wing that looked more like an art gallery than a garage. It was the physical expression of everything Ryan had believed since 19, that the people who worked with their hands deserved beautiful spaces, and that customers deserved to feel like they mattered the moment they walked through the door. The morning of the event, Ryan stood in Emma's doorway watching her negotiate with her reflection about whether her dress was the right shade of pink. "It's very pink," he offered. "That's the point, Daddy," she said, with the gravity of someone settling a long-running debate. He let her win, because he always let her win on pink, and drove them both to Meridian Avenue with the morning sun cutting long gold lines across the street. He'd ask his sister to bring Emma inside first so he could park and walk in quietly, He had never been comfortable with grand entrances, had spent his entire career specifically engineering against them, and so he arrived at his own flagship opening the way he arrived at most things, without announcement, a little early, and entirely at ease. The atrium was already filling. His regional managers were clustered near the service entrance looking slightly nervous in their good suits. The PR team was directing camera crews toward the display floor. His CFO caught his eye from across the room and gave a small nod that meant everything is exactly where it should be. Ryan straightened his jacket, charcoal, clean, nothing that announced itself, and crossed the floor toward the front entrance where Emma had spotted the refreshment table and was conducting a serious evaluation of the dessert options. He crouched beside her. "Find anything good." "They have macarons," she said, with the reverence of a food critic. "Pink ones." "Obviously." She took his hand, and he stood, and that was the precise moment the front doors opened and Sandra walked in on Gerald's arm. Ryan saw her before she saw him. That gave him a half-second of quiet, enough time to simply observe, without reaction, the way a good mechanic looks at something before deciding what it needs. She looked well. Happy, even, or at least the careful, curated version of happy that came with Gerald's world. The right dress, the right posture, the right expression for a room full of cameras and industry names. Gerald had one hand at the small of her back and was already scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone who considered every event a networking opportunity. The regional manager, Thomas, appeared at Ryan's shoulder. "Sir," he said quietly, "Mr. Gerald Ashworth just arrived. He's one of the regional automotive consultants we invited through the industry list." "I know," Ryan said simply. Thomas hesitated. "Should I?" "Just give them the welcome package and let them enjoy the floor," Ryan said. "Same as everyone." Thomas nodded and moved away. Emma was still holding Ryan's hand, now swinging it lightly in the way she did when she was happy and not thinking about it. He looked down at her once, that gap-toothed smile, that pink dress, that absolute, uncomplicated certainty that this was a good day, and felt something settle even further in his chest. He was not nervous. That was the thing that would have surprised Sandra most, he suspected, if she could have seen inside him in that moment. There was no performance being prepared, no speech rehearsed, no satisfaction being constructed. He was simply a man standing in a building he designed, in a life he'd built, holding his daughter's hand. Then Thomas reappeared, leaning slightly towards Sandra's group, saying something Ryan couldn't hear. He watched Sandra's expression shift, a small tightening around the eyes, a polite smile recalibrating. Gerald touched her elbow. Thomas gestured, professionally, in Ryan's direction. Sandra turned. The moment she recognized him, Ryan watched something move across her face that he couldn't quite name and didn't try to. Recognition first. Then confusion, the honest, unguarded kind that happens before the brain catches up. Then something quieter, something that looked less like an emotion and more like a calculation being completely dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. Ryan walked toward them at an easy pace, Emma beside him, her hand still in his. He shook Gerald's hand first, firm, warm, entirely genuine. Gerald was not a bad man, Ryan had decided long ago. He was simply a man who lived at the surface of things and mistook the surface for the whole story. "Gerald, thank you for coming out today." Gerald blinked. "You're," he stopped, regrouped. "You're Ryan Calloway." "I am," Ryan said pleasantly. Gerald's hand was still extended from the handshake. He lowered it slowly. Ryan watched the man recalibrate, watched him scan back through whatever Sandra had told him about the mechanic she'd left, and try to reconcile that image with the man standing in the flagship atrium of a 47-location national automotive group whose name was printed on every wall of the building they were standing in. It was, Ryan had to admit privately, a fairly significant gap to reconcile. He turned to Sandra. Her expression had settled into something careful and composed. She was not a woman who lost herself in public, but her eyes held something real. Something that wasn't quite regret and wasn't quite surprise but lived somewhere in the honest territory between the two. "Sandra," he said, and his voice was easy, the way it was when he meant someone no harm. "It's good to see you." "Ryan." She said it once, quietly. That was all. Emma tugged his sleeve. She had been studying the macarons table with such focused longing that the adult conversation had barely registered, but now she looked up at him with the full weight of a 5-year-old's priorities. "Daddy," she said, "can we get ice cream after? You said maybe." Ryan looked down at her. That gap-toothed smile. That pink dress. That perfectly uncomplicated faith that her father would say yes. "Absolutely, baby," he said. He looked back at Sandra and Gerald once, not to make a point, not to measure anything, simply because it was the natural thing to do in a conversation before it ends. Gerald was already recovering, reaching for professional footing, asking something about the technology division rollout. Ryan answered him genuinely, warmly, the same way he would answer anyone. Sandra stood slightly to the side, her champagne glass held in both hands, watching Ryan the way you watch something you thought you understood completely and are now quietly revising. He excused himself after a few minutes, graciously, without hurry, and walked Emma toward the display floor where his design team had built a small interactive section for families, because he had insisted from the beginning that a flagship opening should be for everyone, not just industry names in good suits. Emma immediately found a display car she wanted to sit in. Ryan lifted her into the driver's seat, watched her grip the steering wheel with complete authority, and took a photograph that he would frame and put on his desk at the main office. His CFO appeared beside him. "Smooth entrance," he said quietly. "Emma found the macarons," Ryan said. "Everything else took care of itself." His CFO smiled. "The Houston numbers came in this morning. Up 22%. "Send the team something," Ryan said. "All of them. Not just the managers." "Already done." Ryan nodded and looked back at Emma, who was now making engine sounds with remarkable commitment. Around them, the event moved and hummed, cameras catching the right angles, industry conversations threading through the atrium, the flagship alive in exactly the way he'd imagined it when it had existed only as a rough sketch on a legal pad at the kitchen table, Emma asleep down the hall. He thought briefly about Sandra. He hoped, genuinely, that she found what she was looking for. He held no version of the story where she was a villain, only a person who had looked at his life and seen the surface, and made a reasonable decision based on what was visible. She simply hadn't known what was underneath. Some stories end when someone walks out the door. Some stories are only just beginning at exactly that moment. Ryan Calloway put his arm around his daughter's small shoulders as she steered her stationary car with total confidence towards some imaginary destination, and felt, cleanly, completely, without complication, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The ice cream, as promised, was excellent.